Welcome to the Books of Titans podcast, where I seek truth in the world's great books. I'm your host, Eric Rostad, coming to you from the beautiful Books of Titans studio in Franklin, Tennessee. My goal is to read 200 of the great books over the next 10 years and share what I'm learning. I'll talk a bit about each book, tie ideas together from a variety of genres, and share the one thing I always hope to remember from each of the great books. Today I'm going to cover The Intellectual Life by A.G. Sertillanges, its spirit, conditions, and methods. This is from book 41 for my 2024 reading list. Quick note to start off here, if you are a French speaker, I probably just brutalized that name and I apologize for that. But this is an excellent book. This is a book about continuing intellectual curiosity throughout your life. I bet you all, to some degree or another, want that. If you're listening to this podcast episode, that's a good sign that you want that. But this is what this book is about. It's almost an anti-aging lifestyle. He says toward the end of the book, it is an astonishing thing that the true intellectual seems to escape those sad effects of age that are death before their time to so many men. He remains young up to the end. End quote. And I love that. You do notice that in people who are searching after truth, who love reading and who love learning. There's almost this childlike aspect of those people. And this is what that book is getting after. It's a book about a particular lifestyle. It's one that offers a ticket to a different world. And so let me read there's a great introduction by James Schall, and I want to read a couple quotes from this introduction. So the first is this, and in this he's kind of talking about what this book does. So here he says this: Sertillanges teaches us how to organize our lives so that we can acquire a solid beginning, hopefully when we are young, and spend the rest of our days building on this solid foundation. So that's the first part, and then another part here is this, where he says that wisdom comes rather late in life. And so what this book is doing is kind of setting you on the path to where you're seeking truth, you're seeking wisdom, and it's built around a lifestyle. So it's a call to a certain way of living. And he starts by suggesting just 2 hours a day, devoting 2 hours a day to a practice of the intellectual life. But what you quickly see in this book, that it is a lifestyle that will permeate all the other hours of your life. So yes, you would dedicate 2 hours to reading, to writing, and that sort of thing. But this is a lifestyle that he's proposing that permeates everything else, even your sleep and your subconscious thoughts. So I want to share my path quickly before I get into the rest of this episode. And that is that I had this idea when I went to college back in the late 1900s, that I would go to college, I would learn what I needed to learn for whatever job I would have, and then that would be the end of it. I would just kind of do that job for the rest of my life and live my life. But what I quickly realized is that things are changing so fast, and that I just was missing something after college. And that thing was just the pursuing truth, pursuing learning, pursuing reading. And so I quickly realized that I needed to have a life of learning. I needed to be a lifelong learner, to be someone who has a continual intellectual curiosity throughout the rest of my life. And I loved this book. I so wish I would have read it earlier in my life, because that is what this book deals with. It just kind of shows habits that you can start today, things that, and just more of a method of thinking about this kind of a life. So the author, Sertillanges, he was born in 1863 in France and died in 1948. He was a French Catholic philosopher and spiritual writer, according to Wikipedia, and he was part of the Dominican order. So this book was written in French. It was translated into English, and it was suggested by Deacon Garlic of the Great Books podcast. And so I follow their podcast. I love it. And I just enjoy seeing what Deacon Garlic is reading. And this is one book he had high praise for. They did a podcast episode on it as well. And so that's why that's where I had heard about it. And then now I'm like sending messages to friends saying, hey, have you heard of this book? Have you read it? And they're like, yeah, I read that a long time ago. And so I somehow missed this book, but I'm glad I finally caught it. For reading stats, it was my final book of 2024. It's 280 pages. It took me 7.5 hours, and I read that between December 25th and 29th. That was 56 pages per day. Took about 1:37 per page. I like sharing that just so you have an idea of how long it might take you to read the book. I'll have 2 more segments in this episode. The next segment 2, I'll cover 3 ideas that stuck out to me, as well as have a section of just advice that I found in this book. And then in segment 3, I'll cover the one thing I'm still thinking about after reading this excellent book. The Intellectual Life. That title does seem a little pretentious, doesn't it? But here's what's involved. Here's what he's talking about. I'm going to start by reading a part right at the beginning on page 11. Do you want to have a humble share in perpetuating wisdom among men, in gathering up the inheritance of the ages, in formulating the rules of the mind for the present time, in discovering facts and causes, in turning men's wandering eyes towards first causes and their hearts towards supreme ends, in reviving, if necessary, some dying flame, in organizing the propaganda of truth and goodness? That is the lot reserved for you. It is surely worth a little extra sacrifice. It is worth steadily pursuing with jealous passion. End quote. So that's your call. That is the call of this book, to pursue that. And he says that you can do it in 2 hours a day. But as I mentioned earlier, those 2 hours will quickly permeate your entire life. So he puts this intellectual life, he puts it in the terms of it being a calling and a vocation. So it's not just a little something you do on the side. This becomes a great part and a great focus of your life. He said one way that this can happen is through habit. And he says, habit has great weight in this matter. Wisely ordered, it acts like a second nature. The other thing he says about this intellectual life is he talks about the books to read, and I'll highlight in that section of advice later on in this segment. But here's kind of the scope of what he would have you to read. He says this: love the eternal books that express eternal truths. Love the eternal books that express eternal truths. Great quote there. I love that one. So in 2017, I made the decision to increase my reading amount, and that's when I started this Books of Titans reading project. And at first, I decided to try to do a book a week, so 52 books a year. And I kind of had this thought or this concern that I might get overloaded or fatigued with the reading, and maybe I would just get sick of it. It would get to be too much. I'd have too many things floating around in my head, and it would confuse me maybe more than help. And what I found instead is that reading actually helps you categorize things, and part of it is just questions I have or things that I wonder about, where you're learning about these things, but then also like you start to see key ideas across a number and variety of books from all times, all cultures, areas, and so you start to see things that are very important. And so where I had this concern that things might get overwhelming, what I actually found is that it helps kind of hone my thinking. It actually kind of helps me categorize things in my mind. And so I don't have that sense of overwhelm or overload, but instead it's invigorating. And that is something that is brought up a lot in this book. And I love that. And I want to say, I want to read quotes that are in this book because he says it so much better than I do. And so the first is just to know and to have this idea that the brain is always working. That is something that comes up quite often in this book. And so what are you going to do to have it working on? Like how are you? it's not an issue of like, oh, if you begin to read, then your mind will start working. That's not the case. Your brain is already working. It's like I tell people, people might ask, like, how do you find time to read? And I'll try to answer in some way of like, everybody reads. You read. Everyone is reading. Maybe they're reading Twitter on their phone. Maybe they're reading emails or reading something, but we're all reading. And even with the advent of the phone in our pocket, we're reading even more. So it's a question of what are you reading and where are you putting your mind to, as opposed to, are some people not reading and then some people reading? We're all reading and our brains are always working. So just know that. But if that's the case, what do you want your brain working on? Do you want it working on mush? Do you want it just working on crap that you put in from TV or social media? Or do you want it working on the biggest questions of life, things that people have been pondering and wondering about throughout the ages? Like, what do you want your brain to work on? And so he asks that question a lot, but then he says things like this. Since as a matter of fact, we are always thinking, why not utilize that thought to the advantage of what we have in mind? Let me read the next part here along this thought. The brain is always performing, but without your intervention and without control. Regulate that operation and let your brain also be an intellectual worker. In practice, you will perceive that this is not in the least tiring, that on the contrary, it saves a great deal of fatigue. For the unsought finds, made like that just by looking about, made simply because one is resolved and trained oneself not to be blind, those discoveries are among the happiest, because spontaneous greatly encourage the seeker. They keep him alert and joyous. He waits with delight for the hour of quiet in which he can fix and develop the newly acquired idea. End quote. I love that. So first, just kind of tying back to how I started this part of having a concern about fatigue or overwhelm. He says it saves a great deal of fatigue, and then just going in this practice of engaging the brain, the discoveries that we get along the way while we're reading or while we're thinking about ideas that we've come across. He says those discoveries are often the happiest. And they really are. Like the things that you almost feel like an archaeologist of digging into works and you come across this treasure and yes, people throughout the ages have also come across that. But when you experience it by yourself, there is just so much power and joy in that. So I love how he talks about that. He also says you will not overload yourself. And that's just such a great reminder. You will not overload yourself. Next up, a mind in love with the spectacle of truth, outspread and shining with its light like the rainbow spanning heaven, grows capable of taking in without fatigue and with delight knowledge that would weary the man drearily confined to a single specialty. End quote. So another thing he talks about a lot is just you've got to read across genres, across specialties and all that. Just don't get focused on one area and only read in that, but expand out. And I loved that. So let me close with one thing here. And this is the kicker. There are in every subject matter a few ideas that govern the whole. End quote. And that really gets back to that idea of it not fatiguing you, not overwhelming you, but you begin to notice certain things. And so within any subject matter that are the main ideas that govern the whole. And so seek those out, and it'll really help you to organize your thinking. Next thing I want to highlight, kind of overarching idea from this book, is that of sleep. And it's interesting to consider the role of sleep in the intellectual life. And it's not one that I would tie to the intellectual life. Like I didn't think going into this book that I would be reading about sleep. I think of the intellectual life of the actions that are a part of that, of the reading, the discussions, the work, but not sleeping. But he suggests that we take the unconscious and that we're taking unconsciousness and night into one service. So sleep, but then also just our unconscious mind and how it's working. And so the way he talks about this is in this manner. So this is on page 81. Sleep is a relaxing of tension. The conscious will lays down its function, ceases to trouble about living, aims at no purpose, and thus finds itself largely given over to the general condition of nature. So he wants us to take this time of sleep and put it to good use. But first, he issues a warning, and the warning is this: the rest one does not take takes itself. It steals into the work under the form of distractions, of sleepiness, of necessary things that demand attention, not having been foreseen at the right time. End quote. I love that idea that the rest one does not take takes itself. So you may think that you can get by with a certain small amount of hours of sleep, but he says it's going to show up in other ways, and it's going to impact your life. And if you're seeking after this intellectual life, you've got to set aside the time for sleep. You can't focus 100% of the time on reading and all that. You've got to take the time for sleep. And here's what he says is going to happen in that sleep. Night, collaborating loyally, has given you without your stir a complete day of 24 hours, perhaps even weeks, the time that it would have taken to hammer out by deliberate effort the splendid jewel now presented to you. End quote. So there's things going on in your sleep that can help with just even putting ideas together that you are reading about during the day. So here's more of the how-to in how to do this. Call to your mind as you fall asleep. Entrust to God and to your own soul the question that is preoccupying you, the idea that is slow in developing its virtualities or that eludes your grasp. End quote. So that's what you do as you're falling asleep. Kind of bring those ideas to mind and let the unconscious, let your mind just go as you sleep. So one thing that I loved that he said is this: the sleeper often unconsciously takes up the position that he had long ago in his mother's womb. That is a symbol. End quote. And so here I just like. I often wind up in the fetal position while I'm sleeping, and he just says, he just ties that to that being a symbol of what we are like when we're asleep, and I thought that was a great picture. I want to close out this segment here just with some advice that shows up in this book, and I thought this might be helpful. A lot of it has to do with writing, but here are just different things that show up in this work. The first is this: neglect nothing where your health is concerned. End quote. He talks about this a lot. He talks about getting outside a lot. Talks about how the intellectual life has to be combined not only with sleep, but with regular exercise. He talks even a lot about breathing exercises and just maintaining health with food and all of that, just to facilitate the intellectual life. Page 184, he says, we retain better what has struck us. We retain better what has struck us. I've definitely found that to be true in this reading project. And so part of it is pursuing the things that you want to know about, because you're going to come across things that strike you. And Cal, a gentleman named Cal, he has this statement that the good SHIT sticks. And so when you're reading, there are things that are going to just stick in your mind, whether you write them down or not. And so we retain better what has struck us. Those two things tie together very well. Here's some advice on the books to read. And so this comes on page 150. Read only those books in which leading ideas are expressed at first hand. These are not very numerous. Books repeat one another, water one another down, or contradict one another, and that too is a kind of repetition. On examination, we find that discoveries in thought are rare. The old stock, or rather the permanent stock of ideas, is the best. One must take one's stand on it in order truly to commune with the intelligence of man, far from petty, stammering, squabbling individualities. End quote. And so focus on the what are mainly called the great books, what I've started calling the immortal books. Those are the books to read, to focus on first of all. Now, here are some items of advice on writing. The secret of writing is to stand and study things ardently until they speak to you and themselves determine their own expression. End quote. He continues on, you must write through the whole of your intellectual life. End quote. So he ties reading and writing very closely together, and in that he says you must write. And on page 200, he says, when you write, you must publish. As soon as good judges think you capable of it, or you yourself feel some aptitude for the flight. So a lot in this book about writing as well. In that writing, he says, cultivate the art of omission, of elimination, of simplification, end quote. And that's the hardest thing to do, but that is the goal. He says, as you're in the process of writing, as you're at your desk, he says, listen as a child listens and write as a child speaks. Great advice. This is the thing I want to close out this segment with. I love this. Your cowardice today is a poor guarantee of your heroism tomorrow. End quote. I talk a lot about on this podcast about direction, the direction of one's life, the direction of your life. And our daily decisions, the small things we do most oftentimes when no one can see it, especially the things that go on in our mind, we're setting a path for ourselves. We're setting a direction. And every time that we are a coward in the decisions we make, it's moving you on one path or another. And you can quickly turn on that path. You can make the right decision, your next decision, and get off the cowardly path. But your cowardice today is a poor guarantee of your heroism tomorrow. If you're wanting to be a certain person or to be a certain way in the future, you that starts today. It doesn't start at some potential point in the future where you just become the superhero. It starts today with small, seemingly insignificant decisions. And so I loved the conciseness of that statement. Your cowardice today is a poor guarantee for your heroism tomorrow. Well, to narrow everything down in this book to one thing, it was quite difficult. When I read, I have a system of underlining and starring things, and then I write like the most important things in the back of the book. I then transfer those notes into my everything notebook, and my everything notebook is the notebook I have with me the entire year. And in just a regular book, there might be 5 stars, if that, throughout the book, like the main things I want to remember. There were so many stars in this book, and so many things that were just gems. They were just gold. That it was hard. But here's I think probably the idea that I enjoyed the most. That is so related to the reading project I'm doing and what I'm seeking after. And it's this simple statement that everything is in everything. He said, to understand a single thing thoroughly, we should understand all things. Let me read just a little paragraph here that goes even more in depth into this. We may assert without any paradox that every branch of science pursued home would lead to the other sciences. Science to poetry, poetry and science to ethics, and then to politics and even to religion on its human side. End quote. I love that idea. As I read different genres and types of books and see ideas that combine or you just begin to notice things and connection points and how things relate to each other. And it's one of the great joys of reading. But I love that. Everything is in everything. I have this idea of if I spent, maybe after this reading project, I want to spend a year just studying trees, reading everything I can about a tree, and maybe just focusing on one tree in my yard or near my area, and just learning absolutely everything I can about that tree, how it grows, how it obtains its water, how it just everything about the tree, how the leaves impact the trunk and all that. And I just have this thought that were I to pursue that, I could pursue that the rest of my life, but everything else would be contained in that study in some way or another, like how our bodies work or how other things in the universe work. But honing in on one tree in my yard and just reading as much as I can, learning as much as I can about that tree. So that's something I want to pursue once this project of reading through the Immortal books is done. Well, this book, I do hope you read this book. It will help you focus your life. If you are young and you are listening to this, please read this now. If you're older, read it. It's great. It's about lifelong learning. But if you know somebody who is young, maybe they're just going into college or they're getting out of college, and this is the perfect book for that person. It will really help them put habits in place, get the right mentality going into what does a life of lifelong learning look like, and how can I start? So, highly recommend this book. I want to leave you with this closing quote. It is a glorious thing to be wholly engaged in what one is doing, like God, who is not separate from his work. This book gives a holy calling and a purpose to your life and to your work. I'm going to close off with that. I am leading a reading group this year, and it is online. It is also in person if you live in the Nashville area. But I assume most of you would be joining in online. And what you can do is join, and it'll be a monthly call. We're going to read one short great book per month. So this month is Gilgamesh. That's going to be next Wednesday. I would love for you to join. The only thing that is required is for you to become a paid subscriber on the Books of Titans Substack. I have a plan for as little as $5 per month. So for just $5 a month, you can join this reading group. I would love for you to participate in it. Gilgamesh is one of the greatest things I have ever read. It blew me away. I read it. I ended up reading it 4 times in a row. I just couldn't get enough of it. So I can't wait to discuss it with a bunch of people who are reading it for the first time. And I've been getting texts from friends and from other people who are reading this book and just saying, wow, I can't believe it. And others who had read it earlier in their life and just, I didn't remember it being like this. This is incredible. So please join in on that if you'd like. Again, just go to my Substack and subscribe at one of the paid levels, and anyone on the paid level will get the email with the Zoom call information, and there are shows the dates and all that. I'll link to that in the show notes about how this short great book program will work this year. That's going to do it for this episode. Thank you for listening. I would love to hear from you. You can email me at eric@booksoftitans.com. If you have a comment about this episode, I would love if you could share that comment on Substack. That's where I host this podcast. And then that just opens your comment up to the community, and we can kind of have a discussion around this book. I would love for that to happen. You can follow Books of Titans on Instagram or Twitter. And also the website is stocked full of resources to help you find the best books and to create a reading list. So check out Books of Titans, the website. If you want to buy this book, I'll link in the show notes as well to a link where you can buy it from Landmark Booksellers. I am the business manager at that bookstore, and that would I would love if you purchased it from us. We can even stamp it with an awesome little Landmark stamp on the book if you would like that. So I will be back next week. I think I'm going to cover my 2025 reading list, so just talk about what's coming up this year. And until then, keep reading, keep learning, and keep listening. I'm out.